There's a ship buried under New Zealand's capital city. Not a model ship, not a sculpture, an actual 19th century ship. Well, part of one, which is still more ship than most capital cities usually keep underneath their shopping arcades. This is Wellington, the capital city of New Zealand. A city squeezed between steep hills and a deep harbour, famous for wind, politics, coffee, and having almost no flat land in a country that already makes geography feel like a personal challenge. And in the middle of that city, beneath the Old Bank Arcade, on Lambton Quay, are the remains of a ship called the Inconstant. Today those remains are known as Plimmer's Ark, which sounds like the kind of local history fact someone made up during a walking tour because the group looked bored. But it's real. There is part of a ship underneath one of Wellington's busiest streets, which raises a fairly obvious question. Why? Because this is not the waterfront anymore. Today Lambton Quay is shops, offices, buses, people walking slightly too fast, and the general feeling that everyone is either late to a meeting or trying to avoid someone from work. This is not the kind of place where you expect to find a ship, but that is the first clue. The strange part is not that a ship ended up beside the water. The strange part is that the water moved away from the ship. Or more accurately, Wellington moved the city over it. Because this part of the capital was once much closer to the harbour. Lambton Quay used to follow the edge of Lambton Harbour. It was even known as the beach, which is hard to picture now because today the beach has been replaced by banks, bus stops, retail, office towers, and people paying $12 for a sandwich. A quay is supposed to be beside the water. Lambton Quay is now several streets from the harbour. Which means either Wellington has a naming problem, or something happened to the coastline. Spoiler, it was the coastline. The ship was called the Inconstant, which is an extremely confident name for something that later became trapped under a city, foreshadowing level aggressive. The Inconstant was a sailing ship that foundered at the entrance to Wellington Harbour in 1849. A businessman named John Plimmer brought the wreck, salvaged it, and brought it closer to the shore. He placed it near the southern end of Lambton Quay, around an area known as Clay Point. Then he used it as a warehouse and commercial space, which is the kind of practical early city thinking you have to respect. Do you have a wrecked ship? Do you need a warehouse? Congratulations, you've solved both problems in a way that will deeply confuse people 170 years later. The ship became known as Plimmer's Ark, and as Wellington grew, the Ark stayed there. Then the shoreline changed. Reclamation pushed the harbour edge outwards, buildings went up. The old Bank of New Zealand building was eventually constructed on the site, and the remains of the ship disappeared underneath the city. Then in 1997, during work under the old bank building, archaeologists rediscovered hull timbers from the Inconstant. Imagine digging under a shopping arcade and finding a ship. This is either an archaeological discovery or the most aggressive basement leak in New Zealand history. Today part of Plimmer's Ark can still be seen under the old bank arcade. So the short version is, a ship wrecked, a businessman salvaged it, it became a warehouse, the city changed the shoreline around it, then Wellington built over it. Very normal, very calm. No further questions from the planning department. John Plimmer did not exactly vanish from Wellington after this. Once you start looking, his name is still scattered around the city. There are Plimmer steps connecting Lambton Quay up towards Bulcott Street. There's a statue of Plimmer with his dog, Fritz, near the bottom of those steps. There is Plimmer House nearby. There is Plimmer Towers. And even Plimmerton, north of Wellington, takes its name from him. So Plimmer is not just some random man attached to one buried ship. His name is attached to the way early commercial grew around Wellington and the harbour, the hills and the awkward problem of getting between them. He was not just a businessman with a suspiciously useful shipwreck. He was also part of early Wellington civic machinery. Plimmer served on early local bodies, including the Wellington Board of Works, and became one of the first councillors on the Wellington City Council when it was founded in 1870, which makes the whole thing feel even more Wellington. The man whose ship was buried under the city was also helping shape the city that buried it. Wellington did not just keep the boat underground, it kept Plimmer's name above it. The full Plimmer cinematic universe is surprisingly walkable. The bigger question is not really, how did a ship end up under Lambton Quay? The bigger question is, how did Lambton Quay stop being next to the water? Because the boat is not the impossible part. The modern street is. Lambton Quay now feels like the middle of the city, but in early Wellington, it followed the harbour edge. It was a part of a waterfront world of boats, warehouse, trade, movement, and shoreline. Now it's inland enough that if you tried to dock a ship there, the first obstacle would be a bus. The boat under the arcade is not just a quirky object. is a clue from an older version of the map. A piece of evidence left behind from before the harbour edge was pushed outward, buried, rebuilt, renamed and turned into the essential city real estate. Because Wellington did not simply grow beside the harbour, it grew into it.
I'm just editing this now and I realise I didn't do the whole, hey, you need to subscribe and like thing. So this is me coming in and saying, please do that. Thank you. All right, on with the learning.
Before we get too far into reclamation, there is another layer of the story. Because it would be easy to describe Wellington's waterfront as if it went water, empty edge, useful city land, but that's not what happened. Long before the colonial city expanded across the harbour edge, there was already the Māori landscape. Māori are the indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Aotearoa is the Māori name widely used for New Zealand. For a global audience, it's worth understanding this clearly. The harbour was not just scenery, it was transport. Food, settlement, identity, connection. Around what is now central Wellington, there were pa, cultivations, streams, landing places, and routes along the harbour. A pa is a Māori settlement, often is fortified. One important site was Te Aro Pa, near what became the southern part of central Wellington. Other communities and places around the harbour edge included Pipitia and Kumatuto. These names are not just labels on modern streets or buildings, they belong to an older geography. So when the colonial city arrived, it was not building on a blank map. It was placing a new map over an existing one. Survey lines crossed places that already had names, uses, relationships, and meaning. Land that later became roads, shops, offices, and commercial blocks had already been part of people's lives. So reclamation is not only an engineering story, it's also a story about which version of a place gets preserved, which version gets renamed, and which version ends up underneath the city. This video is not going to cover the entire history of Māori Wellington, colonial settlement, land conflict, harbour development, and urban planning. Nobody needs to be delivered that by me stood here in this room. But if we are asking how Wellington made more land, we should ask what was already there before the city decided it needed more of it. Because once you add that layer, the story stops just being people filled in the harbour, and it becomes a city expanded over an existing landscape, and the buried ship becomes one clue inside a much older, much larger story. To understand why Wellington started moving its shoreline, you have to look at the city from above. Wellington sits at the southern end of New Zealand's North Island. It is wrapped around a harbour with steep hills pressing in from behind. For geography nerds, it's a fantastic natural amphitheatre. For urban planners, it's a passive-aggressive puzzle. There is water where you want flat land. There are hills where you want suburbs. There is wind where you want basic dignity. And in the middle of it all, there's a city trying to grow. When Wellington became New Zealand's capital in 1865, the pressure became stronger. A capital needs government buildings, offices, port infrastructure, roads, warehouses, railways, businesses, and housing. It needs space. Wellington did not have much. So the city looked at the harbour and reached a very Wellington conclusion. Could that be land? For anyone not familiar with the term reclamation, is when land is created from water, usually by filling in part of a harbour, shoreline, wetland, or seabed. It is the urban planning equivalent of saying, I've decided that this map is wrong, and Wellington did it a lot. By the end of the 1870s, around 70 acres had been reclaimed by the government, provincial, and city authorities. Spoil from the hills behind Lambton Quay and Wadestown Hill was used to fill in parts of the harbour. There was also a major 51-hectare reclamation of Lambton Harbour between Custom House Quay and Pipitia Point. So the shape of the city was not fixed. It was edited. Earth was cut from hills, harbour was filled, the shoreline moved. Places that had once been water became streets, buildings, offices, and eventually shops, selling things to people who'd have forgotten they are standing on a former harbour, which is how you end up with a city centre where the street names still remember the coastline, even when the coastline itself had wandered off. Wellington's shoreline was not only changed by people, it was also changed by one of the most powerful earthquakes in New Zealand's recorded history. In 1855, the Wairarapa Earthquake struck. It was around a magnitude 8.2 to 8.3, which is not a small earthquake. That is not a few things fell off the shelf. That is, the geography would like to make an announcement. The earthquake caused a major uplift around Wellington Harbour. Land was raised. The shoreline changed. A tsunami entered the harbour and flooded Lambton Quay. Some areas that are now part of central Wellington were below sea level before 1855. So when we talk about Wellington being built on changed ground, we're not only talking about engineering. First the earthquake moved the city's edge, then people kept going. Nature started the renovation. Humans saw the renovation and said, could we add some more commercial zoning? This is one of the most Wellington things imaginable. Even the earthquake accidentally contributed to future office space. The ground moved, the coastline shifted, and then the city treated the shift as an opportunity, which is both practical and slightly unsettling, a very common combination in urban history. Wellington's modern centre is full of clues that the coastline used to be somewhere else. Lambton Quay is the obvious one. Again, it's called a quay. It's now not on the quay. Suspicious behaviour, right? But there are also old shoreline markers around the city. In 1976, 14 brass plaques were laid along the old shoreline to show where the harbour's edge used to run. That means you can walk through central Wellington and physically trace the old edge of the water, which is a very strange experience. Because you can stand on a city's footpath surrounded by traffic and buildings and realise that a version of the harbour used to be right there. Not nearby, right there. You can walk from Lambton Quay towards the modern waterfront and feel the gap between old Wellington and new Wellington. The distance is not just space, it's the earthquake uplift, reclamation, commerce, colonial planning, engineering, and the city repeatedly deciding that the harbour edge was negotiable. Very Wellington. Very calm about something quite dramatic. This is why Plimmer's arc works so well as a story. It turns an abstract process into something physical. Reclamation can sound like a planning term, earthquake uplift can sound like a geology term. Colonial expansion can sound like a history term. But a ship under a shopping arcade is harder to ignore. The boat is the bit that the city forgot to fully hide. A leftover piece of the old shoreline sitting underneath the modern city, quietly ruining the idea that the ground here was ever simple. It says, the ground changed, the shoreline moved. The city above you is built on layers. Harbour, foreshore, Māori landscape, colonial settlement, earthquake uplift, reclamation, commercial buildings, shopping arcade, coffee, a very normal sequence of events. Most cities hide their early geography. They cover streams, flatten hills, fill wetlands, straighten roads, rename places, move shorelines. Then after a few generations, everyone acts like the current layout was inevitable. Like Lambton Quay was always meant to be a shopping street, several blocks from the water. Like Custom House Quay was always meant to sit where it does. Like the waterfront was always exactly where the waterfront is now. But cities aren't inevitable. They're decisions. Some are made by people, some are made by the earthquakes, some are made by money, some are made by maps. Some are made because there is a hill in the way and someone owns a shovel. Wellington CBD is the result of all those decisions stacked on top of each other. Once you understand that, the city starts to look different. Lambton Quay stops being just a street name. It becomes a fossil, a reminder of where the water used to be. The old bank arcade stops being just a building. It becomes a doorway into the previous city, underneath the current one. The shoreline plaques stop being street furniture. They become coordinates from an older map. And Plimmer's arc stops being a quirky local history fact, and it becomes evidence. Evidence that Wellington did not simply grow beside the harbour, it grew into it. Which is a lovely sentence and also slightly alarming if you think about infrastructure for too long. So yes, there is a ship buried under New Zealand's capital city. Part of one at least. Lambton Quay is not strange because it used to be near the water. Lambton Quay is strange because the water left, with assistance.